Welcome to another Thai ghost story, episode 10, the Phi Nam Sai summoning. The humid Bangkok air clung to my skin like wet silk as I descended the concrete steps toward Khlong Toei canal. Midnight had just struck, and the city's neon glow barely penetrated the thick canopy of shadows that pooled around the stagnant water. My headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing the oil-slicked surface that reflected nothing but void. I'd been chasing urban legends for 3 years now, documenting the forgotten corners of Southeast Asia's sprawling metropolises. My YouTube channel, Hidden Depths, had garnered a modest following of fellow explorers and thrill seekers who lived vicariously through my midnight adventures. From the abandoned hospitals of Manila to the flooded subway tunnels of Jakarta, I'd seen things that would have sent most people running. But tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't just exploring. I was summoning. The research had taken me 6 months to compile. I'd interviewed elderly taxi drivers who refused to cross certain bridges after dark, street food vendors who whispered about customers who paid in coins that dissolved at sunrise, and temple monks who would only speak about the water spirits in broad daylight, their voices barely audible even then. The pattern was always the same. References to something ancient that lived in the canals, something that had been here long before the concrete and steel transformed Bangkok into a modern metropolis. The locals warned me about Phi Nam Sai, the water demon that lurked in Bangkok's flooded canals. They spoke in hushed tones about pale flesh that moved beneath the surface, about children who vanished near the water's edge, about fishermen who returned with their eyes rolled back white and their tongues speaking languages that predated human speech. One grandmother in Chinatown had grabbed my wrist with surprising strength when I'd mentioned the name, her fingernails digging into my skin as she hissed warnings in rapid fire. Told you. I should have listened. Their ritual was simple enough. 7 drops of blood in the water, spoken incantations in archaic Thai, and a mirror held at the precise angle to catch the moon's reflection. The instructions had been carved into a wooden tablet I'd found in the back room of a curiosity shop in Thonburi. The characters so old that I'd needed to consult 3 different scholars to decipher them. The shop owner, a wizened man whose age seemed to shift depending on the light, had tried to refuse my money when I'd attempted to purchase it. Some knowledge, he'd said in broken English, costs more than coin. My hands trembled as I pricked my finger with the ceremonial blade I'd bought from a street vendor who'd crossed herself 3 times while wrapping it. The knife felt wrong in my grip, too cold, too sharp, as if it had been designed for purposes far darker than simple ritual. The vendor had warned me in fragmented English that the blade drinks deep and remembers taste. I'd dismissed her words as superstition, but now, standing at the water's edge, I could swear I felt the metal warming against my palm. 1, 2, 3. The crimson droplets disappeared into the murky water without a ripple. The canal stretched before me like a wound in the earth, reflecting the scattered lights of the city in broken fragments. The water was darker than it should have been, as if something beneath the surface was absorbing the light. I could smell the decay rising from its depths. Not just the usual urban rot, but something older, more organic. Something that had been fermenting in the darkness for centuries. 4, 5, 6. The canal's surface began to shimmer, though no wind stirred in the air. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in the tropical night. The insects that had been providing a constant soundtrack to the evening fell silent, as if they sensed something approaching that violated the natural order. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed muffled, as though the city itself was holding its breath. 7. The water erupted. It rose from the depths like a grotesque birth, and I understood why the locals whispered of Phi Nam Sai in the dark daylight, afraid to speak its name after dark. The demon's face was a canvas of horror, gouged pale flesh that looked as if it had been carved away by desperate fingernails, revealing glimpses of a yellowed bone beneath. Its eyes were pools of oily black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when it opened its mouth, I saw rows of teeth like broken glass, each one a different size and shape, as if they'd been collected from various victims over the centuries. Water cascaded from its form, but it wasn't the murky canal water. It was clear, impossibly pure, and it steamed when it hit the concrete. The demon's hair floated around its head like seaweed, and I could see things moving within the dark strands. Small, pale shapes that might have been fingers, or perhaps the larvae of something that had no name in any human language. But it was the hands that made me stumble backwards. Long, skeletal fingers ended in red, dripping nails that curved like talons. And as it reached for me, I could see the blood wasn't dried. It was fresh, warm, and falling in thick drops that sizzled when it hit the water. The creature's arms were too long, extending from its torso like the limbs of a spider, and I could see the muscles and tendons working beneath the translucent skin. Ma ni, it whispered, and though I didn't speak Thai fluently, I understood the hunger in its voice. Come here, come here. The voice was layered, not just one voice, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, speaking in unison. I could hear the echoes of every victim it had claimed, their final words woven into its speech like a grotesque choir. There were children's voices among them, high and sweet and terrified, and the sound made my stomach clench with revulsion. I ran. My feet splashed through puddles of unknown origin as I fled through the narrow alleyways that twisted between crumbling shophouses. The demon's laughter followed me, a sound like drowning children, and I could hear the splash of water behind me, even though we were blocks from the canal. The sound was getting closer, and I realized with growing horror that the creature wasn't bound to the water. It was following me, somehow bringing the canal with it. The alleyways of Bangkok's old quarter were a maze at the best of times, but in my terror-driven flight, they seemed to shift and change around me. Streets I'd walked dozens of times before now led to dead ends, and familiar landmarks appeared in the wrong places. The spirit houses that stood at nearly every corner seemed to watch my passage with malevolent interest, their tiny offerings of incense and flowers wilting as I passed. I could hear my pursuer behind me, not just the splash of water but the scrape of claws against concrete, the wet sound of something massive dragging itself along the ground. My headlamp beam danced widely as I ran, illuminating glimpses of graffiti that seemed to move and shift in the light, forming characters and symbols that hurt to look at directly. That's when I remembered the entrance, the hidden passage beneath Lumpini Park that led to the old crypts. Urban explorer forums had whispered about it for years, and no one had ever provided concrete proof. The stories spoke of a network of tunnels beneath the city, built during the colonial period for purposes that had been deliberately obscured by time. Some claimed that they were part of an underground railway. Others insisted they were storm drains, but the most persistent rumors spoke of something darker. Chambers where the authorities had conducted experiments that violated every principle of human decency. Tonight, fleeing from something that shouldn't exist, I found myself hoping the rumors were true. The grate was exactly where the maps said it would be, hidden behind a cluster of frangipani trees whose white blossoms seemed to glow in the darkness. The flowers were wrong, though. Instead of the usual sweet fragrance, they smelled of decay and something chemical that made my sinuses burn. I pried the grate open with shaking hands, the metal screaming in protests, and dropped into the tunnel below. The fall was longer than I had expected, and I landed hard on a surface that felt like broken glass. My headlamp had been knocked askew, and it took me several precious seconds to adjust the beam and assess my surroundings. The tunnel was larger than I'd anticipated, easily wide enough for two people to walk abreast, and it stretched into darkness in both directions. The smell hit me first, a mixture of decay and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. It was the smell of a laboratory, but one that had been abandoned for decades. Beneath the chemical tang, I could detect something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left to rot in a sealed container. The tunnel was lined with old brick, the kind used in colonial-era construction, and the walls wept with moisture that reflected my headlamp's beam like tears. But as I looked closer, I realized the moisture wasn't clear. It had a faint pink tinge, as if it had been contaminated with something that had once been alive. I crawled forward, my knees scraping against the rough stone, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the entrance. Behind me, I could hear the sound of the grate being torn from its moorings, followed by the splash of water and the scrape of claws on brick. The Phi Nam Sai had found me. The tunnel branched ahead of me, splitting into 3 separate passages. I chose the middle one at random. Driven by panic rather than logic, this passage was narrower, forcing me to crawl on hands and knees, and the walls seemed to press closer with each meter I advanced. The pink-tinged moisture was thicker here, and I could feel it soaking through my clothes and into my skin. The passage opened into a chamber that defied explanation. The ceiling stretched upward into darkness, supported by Gothic arches that had no business existing beneath a modern park. The architecture was wrong, too old, too European, as if someone had transported a piece of medieval Europe into the heart of Bangkok. Along the walls, I could see alcoves carved into the stone, each sealed with what looked like iron plates, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and wreathe when I wasn't looking directly at them. But it was the smell that made my stomach turn. The acrid smell of burnt flesh mingled with something sweet and cloying, like jasmine corrupted by death. The air itself felt thick, almost viscous, and each breath was a struggle. I could taste metal on my tongue, and my vision began to blur around the edges. That's when I heard the whispers. They started soft, almost inaudible, but grew stronger as I moved deeper into the chamber. The voices were speaking in languages I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood their meaning. They were pleading, begging, promising anything for release from whatever torments held them. Infant laughter mixed with the sound of claws scratching against stone, and I realized the whispers weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from behind the iron plates. The chamber was a prison, and I had stumbled into the middle of it. Gas ghost chamber, the forum posts had called it. A place where the dead had been sealed away, where the air itself had been poisoned by whatever experiments had taken place here decades ago. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could swear I heard my name being called in a dozen different voices, each one pleading for me to free them from their eternal captivity. The iron plates began to rattle in their frames, and I could see them bulging outward as if something was pressing against them from the other side. The symbols carved into the metal glowed with a faint phosphorescence, and I realized they weren't just decorative, they were binding sigils, holding something back that had been trying to escape for decades. Then I saw the glyph. It was painted on the far wall in what looked like whitewash, but as I approached, I could see it was something else entirely. Something that had once been white, but was now stained with dark patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The symbol was intricate, layered with meaning that my rational mind couldn't process, but my ancestral memory recognized as a binding. It was the keystone that held the entire chamber's containment system together, and I could see the cracks spreading across its surface like a spiderweb. The infant laughter grew louder, more urgent, and the sound of claws became a rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My hand reached out toward the glyph without my conscious permission, drawn by some compulsion I couldn't resist. The air around the symbol felt electrified, and I could feel the hair on my arms standing on end. The moment my fingers touched the surface, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The symbol cracked with a sound like breaking glass, but magnified 100-fold. The phosphorescent glow flared and then died, plunging the chamber into darkness, save for my headlamp's beam. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it was almost deafening. Then the screaming began. The iron plates buckled outward, and through the gaps I could see things moving, pale shapes that writhed and twisted with unnatural hunger. The air filled with the sound of metal tearing and stone cracking. And suddenly the chamber was alive with movement. Dozens of spirits poured from the broken seals, their forms barely human, twisted by decades of imprisonment and whatever experiments had been conducted on them. They moved like smoke, flowing across the floor and up the walls, their eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. I could see their mouths moving, but no sound emerged, as if their voices had been stolen along with their freedom. Instead, they communicated through gestures and expressions that conveyed hunger and rage, and a thirst for revenge that had been building for generations. I ran again, but this time there were nowhere to go. The tunnel behind me had somehow sealed itself, the brick walls flowing together like liquid. The only exit was through a narrow passage I hadn't noticed before, a crack in the wall that led deeper into the earth, away from the chamber and the spirits I'd inadvertently released. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the walls pressed against me from all sides, slick with moisture and something else that felt organic, almost alive. I could hear the spirits behind me, their presence like a cold wind at my back, and I knew they were following, seeping through the stone like smoke. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the earth, and I began to suspect that it wasn't just a tunnel, it was a throat, and I was being swallowed. The walls grew warmer as I descended, and the organic feeling became more pronounced. I could swear I felt them pulsing around me, like the inside of some massive creature's gullet. The air grew thick and humid, tasting of copper and decay, and I realized I was no longer breathing air, but something else, something that had been filtered through lungs that weren't entirely human. The passage opened into another chamber, and I stumbled forward, gasping for air that tasted like incense and copper. This place was different, older, more sacred. The walls were covered in marble that had been carved with intricate reliefs depicting scenes from Buddhist mythology. But something was wrong with the images. The figures were wrong, their proportions twisted, their faces bearing expressions of agony rather than enlightenment. But it was the marble itself that made me stop and stare in horror. It was bleeding. Red liquid seeped from the cracks between the marble blocks, pooling on the floor and filling the air with the metallic smell of fresh blood. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't just blood. There were chunks of something else mixed in it, something that looked disturbingly like human tissue. The walls weren't just bleeding, they were weeping flesh, as if the marble had been carved from living bone. The temperature in the chamber was oppressive, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill that had followed me through the tunnels. The blood on the floor was warm, and it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a massive heart hidden somewhere beneath the stone. I pressed my back against the entrance, but the passage had sealed itself behind me, the stone flowing together like liquid. The chamber was a trap, and I was caught in the center of it, watching as the bleeding walls began to pulse with a rhythm that matched my terrified heartbeat. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical, and I found myself swaying in time with the pulse despite my terror. The blood on the floor began to flow in patterns, forming symbols and characters that seemed to write themselves in the viscous liquid. That's when I saw the altar. It stood in the center of the chamber, carved from a single block of black stone that seemed to absorb light. The stone was so dark it appeared to be a hole in reality, and looking at it made my eyes water. On its surface were offerings, wilted flowers, sticks of incense burned down to nothing, and something that might have been bones, though I couldn't tell if they were human or animal. The bones were arranged in a pattern that suggested ritual significance, and they gleamed with an oily sheen that reflected my headlamp's beam. The air shimmered above the altar, and suddenly I wasn't alone. The Phi descended from the shadows like a nightmare-given form. Its body was skeletal, so thin that I could see the individual ribs beneath its papery skin. But it was the wings that made me whimper. They weren't feathers. They were woven from what looked like human hair and bone, stretched between fingers that were too long and too thin to be natural. The wings spanned the width of the chamber, and I could see the faces pressed against the translucent membrane, their mouths open in silent screams. It landed on the altar with a sound like breaking twigs, and when it turned to look at me, I saw that its face was a skull wrapped in skin so tight it might have been painted on. Its eyes were holes that led to nothing, and when it opened its mouth, I could see straight through to the back of its throat. The inside of its mouth was lined with teeth that weren't teeth at all, but tiny bones arranged in neat rows, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at. Farang, it whispered, and its voice was the sound of wind through a cemetery. You have opened what should remain closed. The creature's hands, if they could be called hands, reached toward me, and I saw that its fingernails had been replaced with what looked like rusted metal shards. The metal was old, corroded, and it wept a fluid that might have been blood or might have been something worse. When it moved, I could hear the bones creaking like old wood, and the smell that emanated from it was indescribable. Acid and rotting flesh, and something that might have been burning plastic. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber was sealed, the walls still weeping their mixture of blood and tissue, and the Phi was between me and any possible escape. The creature moved with deliberate slowness, savoring my fear, and I could see intelligence in those hollow sockets. Not just animal hunger, but something that understood suffering and took pleasure in it. It moved faster than something that skeletal should have been able to move. And suddenly I was on the ground, its weight pressing down on my chest. The bone wings spread wide, blocking out what little light my headlamp provided, and I could feel its fingers, those metal-tipped mockeries of human hands, beginning to tear at my clothes. The spirits you released must feed, it whispered, and I could smell its breath, which was like opening a tomb. They hunger for the flesh of the living, for the warmth that has been denied them. You have given them freedom. Now you must pay the price. The pain started in my abdomen, a tearing sensation that made me scream until my throat was raw. I looked down and saw what it was doing. Those metal claws were opening me up, peeling back skin and muscle with surgical precision. My intestines gleamed wet and red in the torchlight, and I could feel them being pulled from my body like rope. The creature worked with the skill of a surgeon, ensuring that I remained conscious for as long as possible. But I was still alive, still conscious, still feeling every moment of it. The creature's skull face leaned closer, and I realized it wasn't just feeding, it was savoring. The hollow sockets where its eyes should have been seemed to drink in my agony, and its lipless mouth curved in what might have been a smile. It whispered to me in languages that predated human speech, describing the things it would do to me, the ways it would use my body to feed the spirits I'd released. That's when my camera started recording. I'd forgotten about the body cam I always wore during explorations, the one that automatically activated when I detected elevated stress levels. Through my fading vision, I could see the red light blinking, capturing every moment of my dismemberment for posterity. The camera was designed to upload footage automatically to a secure server, ensuring that even if something happened to me, the evidence would survive. The Pi Krahang noticed it too, and its head tilted in curiosity. It reached out with one bloodied claw and touched the lens, leaving a smear of my own entrails across the glass. The creature seemed to understand what the device was, and its skull face contorted in what might have been amusement. "Let them see," it whispered. "Let them know what waits for those who disturb the sleeping dead. Let them understand that some doors should never be opened. Some seals should never be broken." My vision was fading, but I could still hear the whispers of the spirits I'd released. Still feel the Pi Krahang's claws working inside my body. The camera kept recording, its mechanical eye watching impassively as I was taken apart, piece by piece. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, but the pain kept me anchored to the world, refusing to let me escape into unconsciousness. The last thing I remembered was the creature's laughter, a sound like breaking bones, and the wet squelch of something vital being torn from my chest.